Advance Happy Women's Day to every woman seated here. So nice to see you all color coordinated and in kalamkari, our Women's Day special. But I think this Women's Day, the main thing that we wanted to focus was to celebrate the women who have done so much for God and who've contributed so much to God's kingdom, and draw inspiration from them and see how we can embrace the truths from their lives and also contribute towards God's kingdom. So for today's sermon, as usual, I will go back to the Old Testament, and I just wanted to focus on the book of Esther. So before we start diving into the book of Esther, I thought it will be good for us to have a good idea of the context of the book of Esther. As you all may be very familiar with Jeremiah's prophecy, right? Jeremiah prophesied that the people of Israel will be taken into 70 years of captivity, and the Babylonians will come and take them into captivity. And so the book of Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther is set against the backdrop of the Jews who were taken as captives into exile, who were taken as captives by the Babylonians and subsequently by the Persians, right? So, and the book of Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Daniel, they give us a glimpse into the lives of Jews, or God-fearing Jews, who lived in a foreign land under foreign kings who served foreign gods. Yet these people, they remained faithful and true to their God. They believed in the promise of God's redemption, and you can find that throughout the story you will find that their faithfulness to God was tested. We see that in the story of Daniel. We see that in the story of Esther. Their faithfulness to God was tested, and their belief in the promise of God, that God is going to redeem this nation of this group of Jews who were taken as captives, even that was challenged. And yet the sum of all the story, what you notice is they all prevailed. Okay, and they did great exploits for God. And in Daniel chapter 11, verse 32, it says, people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. So today we are going to focus on the book of Esther, because tomorrow is International Day for Women, and it's always, I think, there is so much life's lessons that we can learn from women. And the book of Esther and book of Ruth are the only two books in the Bible which are named after women. And there must be something special about their lives, that their books, their story has been captured as a special book in the Bible itself. And when we talk about the book of Esther, what we notice is that the key phrase in the book of Esther, any guesses? What is the key phrase in the book of Esther? Something that we usually say. For such a time as this, right? We always say Esther was born for such a time as this. And that is a very key phrase. And I think there is lots that we can learn. We are also living in times where we are living, we are not permanent citizens of the earth. We are sojourners here. This land is not our home. We are only called to live as God's ambassadors on this earth. And like we are placed in this world so that we can, be God's ambassador and bring his truth and speak his truth in this generation. And so I think there is so much that we can learn from the book of Esther, and I will try to see what I can. I'm just going to make it like a storytelling. It won't be like a 3-point sermon. And so we'll start with the book of Esther. If you notice, the book of Esther, as most of you may know, it is a very interesting book, and it has no mention about God. The word God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, right? And many people say the author of the book, some scholars say could be Mordecai, but officially the author is unknown. And even Martin Luther, he did not like it because God is not mentioned in the book, and he really did not want even this book to exist. But interestingly, this book exists in the Jewish canon of books, and also in the biblical canon of books, right? So there is something so important that we can learn from this book of Esther. And this book of Esther is every year during the festival of holiday of Purim, it's read in the synagogues. And so it's and every woman, though it is not mandatory for the woman to come and be there, she is expected to come just to listen to the book of Esther every year. And so it is such a very powerful story. It is a story that the central theme of the book of Esther is God's providential care for his chosen people. And you can see throughout the story how God's providential care is seen. You can see how he preserves the life of his chosen people. Okay, and it is also an interesting mix where you can see the working of God's sovereignty and man's free will. God is supremely sovereign. He's on the throne. He's in control. And Bible also says the king's hand is in the heart of God and he changes it like a water course. And when you see this book of Esther, you see that in the later chapters, one night when King Xerxes is sleeping, he's not able to sleep. God doesn't give him sleep until he reminds him of Mordecai's good deeds and how Mordecai is later honored, right? So throughout this book of Esther, you will see God's sovereign hand working in the natural affairs of men. And it is a very good reminder for us in these times that however challenging the times that we are in, God is sovereign and he is supreme and he is involved in the affairs of men, and no government, no people are above God. And God is fully in control. And the second thing that you also see is at the same time how God works in the story through man's free will. So it's a very interesting combination of these two things. And one of the scholars actually has written about this. He says, we are meant to see through the book of Esther in the natural outworking of events without violating human free will, without interrupting the ordinary going of human affairs, a hidden power unsuspectedly but unfailably controls all things. God works in the natural affairs of men. Right? So many times when we go through very difficult situation, we may feel that God is out of sight. But I think we have to remember, though he may be out of sight, we are never out of his sight. He cares for his own. The God of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. Okay, God may be strangely silent, but he is actively sovereign. There may be struggles in our life which are temporary, but God will always triumph. So this book is again a book which starts with, it is a book, if you read the first few chapters, you feel that there is a crisis there. But in the end, you see that it ends in triumph. You see that how God works silently in the background. He averts the crisis and he overturns the crisis in favor of his people. Okay, so, and it is also a very powerful story to see how God uses people. So A.B. Simpson, the founder of Christian and Missionary Alliance, he said this: God is preparing his heroes, and when the opportunity comes, he can fit them into their places in a moment, and the world will wonder where they came from. God is preparing his heroes, and when the opportunity comes, he can fit them into their places in a moment, and the world will wonder where they came from. And this is exactly the story of Esther. You see the book of Esther starts with chapter 1, where this Queen Vashti is being dismissed, and you feel, and there is this void in the king's palace. At some point, he begins to feel he's missing Queen Vashti, and then he sends an order he is advised to bring in all the beautiful girls in the from his kingdom, and then and the thing is, and the woman that he likes, he's going to make her as the queen. So that's, I'm making it very simple. It's not as I'm trying. This is a familiar story, so I'm just not trying to go into the details of this. But you see, in contrast to that, Esther, as this Esther is someone who is she's an exile. She and her, in my Bible it says Mordecai's uncle's daughter is Esther. So, and he found she lost her parents, and so he decided to take her into his house as his own daughter. And we don't know if Esther on her own volunteered for that thing, because I don't think any woman, knowing what this king particularly, he was a king who had this, the kings of Persia apparently had the biggest harems in the world. And so the thing is, these young girls are brought in, and after a night, the king puts them as if he doesn't favor the girl, she ends up in the second house of women, and she serves as a concubine for the rest of her life. And I don't think this was a very delightful opportunity for any woman. And I think as parents, if we had girls, we would make sure the moment we heard that we will hide our girls from the eyes of the king's officers, right? So that was the kind of situation. But for some reason, we don't know how. Bible doesn't say. Maybe scholars may have interpretation how she got picked up. Sometimes we paint the picture that it's a beauty pageant, but we don't know, right? She seems to be picked up, and she's taken into the house with the other women for beauty preparations. And we can see that in the second chapter of Esther. And you see that Mordecai, as a very doubtful, relative, he's her foster dad, right? Because he's taken her as her own daughter, and every day he goes to the king's court, women's court, and then he inquires about Esther. There is this anxiety, right? Because imagine if she doesn't, if the king doesn't favor her, she's going to end up along with the concubines. And what chance does she stand against other people? She's just an orphan in a simple household, probably. And she's young, she's beautiful, and that's it. Beyond that, she doesn't have any experience to impress, or we don't know, right? And that was her situation. And there was this anxious Mordecai. I presume he was anxious, and he would go every day to check on her welfare, and he would see how she's doing and how. But if you see Esther chapter 2 verse 9, even in those natural outworking of things, Esther chapter 2 verse 9, you see that now the young woman pleased him. Him refers to Haggai, the custodian of the woman under whose care Esther was taken in. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her beside her allowances. And then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of women. How do we know the sovereign God is working behind the scenes? You can see this favor come. Again, if you go back to verse 15, it says, now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the woman, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. Again, you see the Bible references that, there was God's favor upon her. Then again, you go back to verse 17. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. She obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. So you can see how she was taken in. Probably it was an unpleasant thing, but then you see behind the scenes God working so divinely. God helped her find favor in the eyes of um, the eunuch. God helped her find in the eyes of all who saw her. And then finally, the climax part is when she comes before the king loved her and she found grace and favor in the sight of the king. And overnight, probably from obscurity, she rises to a place of prominence. And if we were to explain in modern terms, she was the first lady of Persia. Such a powerful role, a role to probably influence the king. She didn't wield power over the king, but she had the power to influence. She was in a place of prominence. She was in a very important position, a very privileged position, and she was very near to power. And so sometimes I think, even in our lives, when we look back at our lives, when we go through, each of us, if I were to ask you your testimony, I think we all recognize how God has extended his favor in our lives. And he has given us, and we have come to, we experience God's privilege in very many ways. Sometimes it may be a position that God gives you in your life. Sometimes he uniquely gifts you. Sometimes he gives you a lot of comfort. And but we never understand why. At that time, probably Mordecai would have thought, okay, now that she has become a queen, we can somehow get her to ask the king to be a little more gracious to the Jews. Maybe influence the king to get some orders that will favor certain aspects of Jewish life, and probably that is all that he must have thought about that, right? And we never know why God brings certain privileges why God sometimes so divinely favors us, brings certain privileges into our lives in the form of position, comfort, relationship, talents, but we don't know. But in hindsight, probably few years later, when we sit back and think, we will understand there is a purpose why God works in mysterious ways, why God has given you such privileges. And sometimes the privilege may not be as something very positive. In that context, I wanted to talk to you about the story of Helen Roosevelt. As I said, I always like telling Helen Roosevelt. This was the quote. I think Sheridan has always encouraged me to read her story. And, but here, I came across this quote of her, which was very powerful. And then I thought I will just walk you through a little bit of her testimony. And her privilege was not in this aspect. She says, God never uses a person greatly until he has wounded him deeply. The privilege he offers you is greater than the price you have to pay. The privilege is greater than the price. So this is a story about this young girl in England who grows up in a very middle class Christian family. Okay, and I think it'll be the story of our children too, growing up in a very good Christian family, regular to church. But at some point, I think she was struggling with this question because it was the time of World War II. And then she saw the devastation the World War II has caused in the lives of so many people around her relatives. And how can a good God allow so much suffering? And this began to, really didn't make sense in her life. This God didn't make sense in her life, and she wanted this God out of her life. But coming from a family that goes regularly to the church, she was very careful. She said, though I wanted to do nothing with him, I was a little nervous. To make sure I'm somehow covered, I kept one foot in the world and one foot, with God, so that in case, there is some cover for me. And she says, then after her, when she joins college, she comes across a group of young girls, and they invite her regularly for Bible study, and she goes with them, and she sees that the way they talk about God is so different. They talk about him in such a way that they know him so personally. And she said the way they also relate on the campus with people, they are very helpful, they are very generous, they are so kind. And she was really drawn to the goodness they exuded in their character. And so She says when they invited her to a conference, she decided to go for the conference. And at the end of and she says the preacher spoke from, I think, Romans and Genesis or something. And she said he was like really, it was convicting her so much to give her life for Jesus. And she finally, eventually, at the end of the conference, she says she gives her life to Jesus. And the preacher who was speaking at the conference was Graham Scrooge. And when he gave her a new Bible, after she made her commitment to follow Jesus, he wrote this in her Bible. Tonight you entered into the first part of the verse, Philippians 3:10. That I may know him. This is only the beginning, and there is a long journey ahead. My prayer for you is that you will go on through the verse to know the power of his resurrection, and also, God willing, one day, perhaps, the fellowship of his suffering, being made comfortable unto his death. Okay, so the later part is very important. Okay, for tonight you've entered into the first part of the verse, that I may know him. This is only the beginning, and there is a long journey ahead. My prayer for you is that you will go on through the verse to know the power of his resurrection, and also, God willing, one day, perhaps, the fellowship of his suffering, being made comfortable unto his death. Then she says, that very night, she says, she made this prayer back to God. Afterwards, I went up into the mountain and had it out with God. Okay, God, today I mean it. Go ahead and make me more like Jesus, whatever the cost. But please, knowing myself fairly well, when I feel I can't stand anymore and cry out, stop, will you ignore my stop? And remember that today I said, go ahead. Okay? And this was such a very powerful prayer that a young girl made. And she knew that very night there was nobody who prophesied over her life, no spoken word into her life. But she says, I knew I was meant to go as a missionary. And she goes as a missionary to Africa, the Belgian occupied Congo. And so I'm not going to talk about her missionary story there. So she again talks about the Congo was a colony of Belgium, like we were once upon a time under the British. So it was, and the Belgian government had completely left, and they didn't prepare for the Congolese people the safe transition from one government. And so what happened was, there were these rebels who completely took over. And they massacred over 200 priests, raped some nuns. And she says more than 250,000 of their own fellow brethren were massacred by the rebels. And soon enough, one day, she was also the target. She was held captive by them. And she said those 5 months were very grueling months. So much of torment, torture, and even it led up to the point of rape. And so she describes the horror of what happened after she tried to escape. Okay, and I'm not going to go through that, but then she says, she later recounted, on that dreadful night, beaten and bruised, terrified and tormented, unutterably alone, I had felt at last God had failed me. She said, I've never lost the confidence that God cared for me. I had felt at last God had failed me. Surely he could have stepped in earlier. Surely things need not have gone that far. I had reached what seemed to be the ultimate depth of despairing nothingness. In this darkness, however, she sensed the Lord saying to her, you asked me when you were first converted for the privilege of being a missionary. This is it. Don't you want it? These are not your sufferings, they are mine. All I ask of you is the loan of your body. What a powerful testimony. So many times we live our lives in the realm of knowing God. We don't realize so many, not just men, even women who have sacrificed their life, gone on before us to show what it means to serve. And that's how I want to summarize the beginning part of the quote again. God never uses a person greatly until he has wounded him deeply. The privilege he offers you is greater than the price you have to pay. The privilege is greater than the price. Right? So sometimes the privilege may not be like Queen Esther. It was not the kingdom, you know. Sometimes, it can be even through difficult circumstances. At the end of it, God is sovereign. He is on the throne. He is in control. He works all things for his good and for his glory. Whether it is good or bad, God is on the throne. And I think that is the kind of life that he is expecting each one of us. Each of us seated here are very mature Christians in the Lord. And we are just such a privileged church because I think in this church, every member is a believer. Right? What a powerhouse we have here for God. So, do not take your privileges lightly. Do not take the favor of God upon your life lightly. There must be a purpose somewhere. You may not know now. In hindsight, you will know. Whether it is in the good or it is in difficult circumstances. Okay. So the story of Esther doesn't end here, right? We all know the story. Sometimes I feel very redundant telling the story because but I want to narrate it still. So the story continues here. It just feels like God and Satan are playing a game of chess. Okay, you find on one side Satan planning to completely destroy the Jews. On the other side, God has made Esther queen. Like, remember the game of chess, and queen is a very powerful piece in the game, right? And God has placed a queen there. Right? On one side, you see Haman. Satan is raising a Haman to exterminate the Jews completely. Always Satan targeted God's chosen people, right? He was after their life. He tried his best to separate them from God, but always God preserved a remnant. And when there was a remnant, he tried to go after them. Right. And here God was raising Satan was raising Haman to completely exterminate the Jews. Right. So you can imagine like a game of chess. God is always the victor. He's on one side with Queen Esther. Here you have Haman. Now I want you to read Esther chapter 3 verses 10 and 11. So, okay, here, the context before this is, what happens. Haman is very angry that Mordecai will not bow down to him. And he realizes he's a Jew. And then he decides, I have to do away this group of people. Right? He goes and meets King Xerxes. King Xerxes says, okay, fine. And you read in Esther chapter 3, verses 10 and 11. So the king took a signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you. Do with them as seems to you. It seems like this side is very weighty, right? Haman has the king's signet ring. He can write anything he wants and put a signet. All money is in his hand, so he has power on his side. Secondly, he has all money on his hands. Right? And then thirdly, he has people at his disposal. All he has to do, one mission that Satan wants to accomplish through him is to exterminate the Jews. But the story doesn't end that way, right? Again, the story reminds you that God is sovereign and he still works in the natural affairs of men. Okay? And so you can see on one side, as Satan is raising Haman, God is to exterminate the Jews. On the other side, God is raising Esther to preserve the Jews. And she never knew that God was going to use her to preserve the Jews. And the story goes on like that. If you keep reading, you notice that Mordecai confronts her. I'm not going into the details of the story. Mordecai, through the eunuch, confronts her and tells her, see, the reason when that particular order was issued throughout the kingdom of Persia, the whole group of Jews, they covered themselves in sackcloth. They began to weep and pray, fast and pray, right? And so Mordecai tells her the reason for why. Probably Esther was in a very secluded place and probably she didn't get the news, so we don't know what. But so she is there, and Mordecai tells her, in Esther chapter 4, Esther chapter 4, he tells her to go and confront the king. Not confront, basically plead with the king for the people. Right? And then Esther tells him, see, the odds are all against her. If you notice, she says, see, I can't just like that go to the king, because the king of Persia, historians say, he was a very impatient guy, a very angry man, and a voracious womanizer. So you can imagine a kind of guy who was very unstable, and you don't know what will make him angry. And in my Bible, in the footnote, there is a piece that says that there is a picture of a painting, a carved relief excavated from the royal city of whatever, shows Darius seated on the throne with a royal scepter in his right hand and a crown, and Prince Xerxes standing behind him, and the royal bodyguards standing around with axe, sword, bow, and all those kind of things, to kill people. So to enter the king's inner courts was not something that anybody could take it lightly. So here you find out Haman has everything. He has the king's power, he has money, he has people to do what he wants. But here with Esther, the odds are against her. She tells Mordecai, through the eunuch, she tells him, see, there is a law that, the law is not on her side. There is a law that no one can visit the king unless the king summons. Second thing, it's been 30 days since the king has summoned her. And she says, don't you know that if I go, I may die? And that's when I think it probably dawns on Mordecai. And probably, we'll read Esther chapter 4, 13 and 14. So it says, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther, don't think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And probably Mordecai realized the promise of God, and he realized the call upon Esther's life, and the purpose for which she was taken to the king's palace was to be a deliverer to the people of Israel, to bring deliverance to the to bring deliverance to the Jews. And but she had every legitimate reason why she cannot take a stand. But then she had an uncle who had to remind her that. And there is another quote in my Bible, it says, no place of privilege can ever exempt a person from responsibility to respond to God's call. No place of privilege can ever exempt a person from responsibility to respond to God's call. No place of privilege can be an excuse for us not to respond to God's call. The privilege, it was very costly, because if she goes in and the king did not like her, she's going to be dead. And her fears were legitimate. And sometimes in life, in the privileges that God offers us, there are so many opportunities that he opens for us. And we are required to take a stand, to step out of our comfort zone. And sometimes we hold back because we are not sure, right? And we tend to rationalize things. We begin to think sometimes our fears are so legitimate. We are genuinely afraid because we think, okay, we are not capable to do this. And sometimes we feel like we are inadequate. We don't have enough resources to do this. Or sometimes we say, this is not for me. Or sometimes we even have the audacity to say it may be too little, it is not so important, right? And so many times God brings opportunities. And it's very important. Sometimes the opportunities that God brings us may cost our privileges even. We don't know, but God expects us to respond to the opportunities that He has given. Responding to this God-given opportunities even is a privilege. So Esther, you see how she counters back. So she sends a word to, we can read in Esther chapter 4, again, verses 15, 16. So then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews who are present in Sushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Right? Esther's fears were legitimate, but I don't think at any point in the story she was hesitant to do, but she was very unsure, is it okay to do that? And I think with some guidance from Mordecai, she was able to understand she can't do it alone. It is a situation beyond her ability. And so she says, I need everyone to fast and pray and to back me up. I will also do that, and my maid servants will do. And so you find that eventually at the end, you find that Esther gathers her courage. She goes, appears to the king grants her request, and the story, the end of the story and how completely it is averted. So in the game of chess, again, the winner was God, right? So sometimes I think the divine favors that God brings in our life, it's very important that we take those favors, the privileges that God gives us very seriously. We don't get comfortable with that, and we should not waste it on ourselves, but we have to get out of our comfort zone and understand what is the purpose behind it, and when God moves, move along with God. And there is a king in the Bible who took God's favor for granted. If you want, you can read 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 25. But Hezekiah did not repay according to the favors shown him, for his heart was lifted up. The anger of God was looming over him and over Judah and over Jerusalem. So there is also a king who did not respond according, maybe the circumstances were largely different from that of Esther. But I think it's very important to understand. It's very important to understand why we take God-given privileges in our lives very seriously and respond according to God's call. So as a closing, I want to leave us with this simple verse. There is this, again, I always like telling stories. Again, there is this beautiful story. This is the story of a very prayerful mother. It is, God wants us to lead a life that impacts people, right? And here's the story of this mother, Susan Wesley. She had 17 children. I hope. Okay, she had 17 children. And of course, it says that, only 10 of her children made it to become adults, because in those days, families had so many children, and I don't know if they were able to give adequate care. Many died, and 10 of them made it. And it's very interesting story about her, and it says that how she was a very prayerful mother. Her commitment to pray, and particularly for her children. So her husband was Samuel Wesley, who spent his time in jail. And, there were so many problems as a family she was going through. She was a mother of 17 children. And then there was so much work to get done, so many challenges, financial struggles, husband in prison. But she was a very godly woman, a very prayerful mother. Apparently, when she was young, she made a commitment to the Lord: for every hour I spend in entertainment, I will pray for that every 1 hour. It's the commitment that she made to God. But she realized after marriage with 17 children, she didn't have the time to spend so much with God. And she eventually felt that she was beginning to feel empty inside. And so she decided, I have to go back and rethink about my commitment to God, because her leisure time was very limited. And so her prayer time became very small, and she began to feel very empty. And so she thought about her pledge as a child, and she realized that she cannot keep to it, right? So she decided she has to somehow find time to get away and pray. And she made a commitment that she would pray every day 2 hours to the Lord. And so she told her children that if they see her with her apron over her head, that she should never be disturbed because she is praying. And she also says, when we don't have time to pray, we need to make more time for it. And she was such a very prayerful woman. And as a result of her prayer and her godly life, she influenced her children, and two of them went on to become two big pastors in the Christian world, John Wesley and Charles Wesley. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, right? And Charles Wesley, who wrote over 9,000 hymns. And it's very interesting. It says, as Susan Wesley prayed, God answered her in many ways. Sometimes he provided in outward ways because she had a lot of challenges. And sometimes he strengthened Susanna on the inside. Either way, her children had front row seats of seeing God at work. And it is said that John Wesley, at the age of 70, he preached to a group of 32,000 people without mic. Imagine at the age of 70 to be at this age itself, we struggle to do even a little bit for God, but just see the passion. And it's very interesting. The children say, John Wesley once said, I learned more about Christianity from my mother than from all the theologians in England. And that is the power of a mother. And sometimes the privilege that God has given us may be to impact just in your home. You will never know if you're going to raise Wesleys. Sometimes your influence may be larger than that in your workplace. Sometimes the privileges God has given you in your work may be to be influenced there, to be an influence for Him. But I don't know, for each one only has to find out, right? And appropriately respond to the position of privilege and favor that God has endowed us with. And I want to close with this verse which says, the eyes of the Lord go to and fro. Looking for, I'm sorry, I forgot. The eyes of the Lord run to and fro to make Himself strong on behalf of those who are loyal to Him. And I think this is the call to each one of us seated here, right? We are all mature believers. We have sat in our places too long. We've made ourselves comfortable in our faith. We've made ourselves comfortable with the privileges God has given us. But if we are going to sit like this, it will not be us. God will raise another person. The opportunity will move on. And I think that is the beautiful call from the book of Esther. Let's not waste the favor of God in our lives. Let's not waste the privilege of God upon our lives. And let us respond in the area where God has kept you as your influence. Amen.